A lonely widow paid $1 for a muscular Navajo man with a sack on his head at auction. Falls head. The wind in Wyoming had a way of speaking, not in words, but in long, tired sighs that passed through cracked wooden boards and under doors that hadn't been opened in years. Esther Hale knew those sighs. They echoed through the walls of her cabin and the hollow of her chest. She had lived alone for 3 winters now, in a house too quiet for comfort and too worn for nostalgia. Each morning followed the one before like footprints in snow, familiar, faint, soon forgotten. She would wake, stoke the fire, tend to the fence that the wind had bullied overnight. She moved with the rhythm of someone who wasn't waiting anymore, but hadn't quite stopped hoping either. The neighbors saw strength in her solitude, misreading silence for resilience. They didn't see her pause at the window, eyes drifting toward the hills, as if waiting for something, someone, that might never come. Arthur had vanished on a hunting trip 3 winters ago. No body, no last word, just absence. Since then, Esther had become a ghost in her own home, doing what needed to be done but never stepping outside the narrow path her grief had carved. The world had moved on, but she had made a quiet deal with time. Stay still and it won't hurt as much, but even stillness cracks. She didn't know it yet, but that morning, just like all the others, would unravel something inside her, not with a thunderclap but with the soft tear of something brittle giving way. By the time the sun would hang low in the sky, she'd stand in front of a man with a sack over his head and chains around his wrists. And in that still, impossible moment, she would not see a stranger. She would see herself. Esther hadn't been to town in weeks. The list she carried, coffee, salt, lamp oil, was an excuse more than a necessity. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She needed to hear a voice other than her own. Even if it was just the butcher's tired greeting or the gossipy whispers near the fabric stall. She saddled her mare before dawn, letting the morning mist cling to her shawl like the memory of a dream she didn't want to explain. By the time she arrived, the market was already alive. Horses clopped over loose stones, children darted between wagons, and the air smelled of cinnamon bread and wet leather. For a moment, she melted into the ordinary. But just as quickly something splintered. A crowd had formed near the livery. Not the usual gossip circle, this one was thick with tension. Esther drifted closer, drawn by a current she couldn't name. The sound came first, sharp, performative. Fresh stock, boys, strong arms, quiet tongue. Good for the barn or the fields, or whatever else you've got in mind. Then she saw him. A man stood on a makeshift platform, his hands bound, his face hidden beneath a rough sack. His skin was deep bronze, his frame powerful even under dust and rope. Navajo, she guessed. But it wasn't his heritage that stopped her, it was his stillness. Everyone around him laughed, bartered, ogled. He stood as if carved from something ancient and unbreakable. It hit her all at once. How wrong it was, how tired she was of watching wrongs. And before she could stop herself, before the world could flatten again, she opened her mouth. $1. The words came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. The noise around her hiccuped, then froze. A few men chuckled, thinking it was a joke, but she stepped forward, her boots crunching over gravel with intent. $1, she said again, steadier this time. The auctioneer, a lanky man with tobacco-stained fingers, raised an eyebrow. "Lady, this ain't." "Sold," she interrupted, louder now. The rope was handed to her like a leash. She took it with both hands, the coarse fibers biting into her palms. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. Just turned his head ever so slightly, as if he could see her through the sack, or feel her intention settle into the space between them. She led him down from the platform, away from the crowd. The hush that followed her felt like a storm holding its breath. She heard someone snort behind her, "Crazy widow," but it didn't land. She wasn't sure why she did it. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't guilt. It was something older than either, something primal. She'd seen in him the echo of her own captivity, the silence she wore like a second skin. By offering a single, the road out of town was long and quiet, stretching ahead like a promise she hadn't meant to make. Esther walked slightly ahead, the coarse rope in her hand leading the way. Behind her, the man's footsteps dragged in the dirt, slow, steady, shackled. The chain around his ankles clinked with each step, a harsh rhythm against the soft sigh of wind stirring the prairie grass. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't because they had nothing to say. It was because too much had already been said in other lives, other silences. Esther wasn't sure what she had expected. Gratitude, resistance, maybe even fear. But the man followed without question, without pause, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Like a thundercloud far off, waiting. She stole glances over her shoulder, but the sack remained over his head, a ghost between them. She could see his hands, though rough, scarred, stained by sun and time. Hands that had known both work and restraint. The image disturbed her, not because of what it said about him, but because of what it said about the world she lived in. A world where $1 could buy a human body, and no one batted an eye. By the time they reached the edge of her land, dusk had begun to settle, painting the sky with strokes of lavender and rust. The horses in the corral shifted at the scent of a stranger, and even the dog, half blind and more bark than bite, let out a low growl. Esther stopped at the fence. Her heart beat louder than the wind now, but still she said nothing. She turned to him and for the first time reached up to untie the knot at the back of the sack. Her fingers trembled, not with fear but with something harder to name. Anticipation, uncertainty, a quiet kind of reckoning. The sack slid off slowly. Underneath, the man blinked against the dim light. His face was lean and strong, weathered but calm. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers without flinching. They didn't widen in surprise or narrow in suspicion. They just looked steady and open. He didn't ask why she'd done it. She didn't offer a reason. But something passed between them in that long, still moment. A recognition, not of faces or names, but of weariness, of having been seen. Esther nodded once, barely more than a breath. The knife she used wasn't particularly sharp. It had once belonged to Arthur, dulled from years of cutting rope and meat and time. Esther held it in her hand that evening, the barn bathed in the last amber light of the sun. The man stood just inside the doorway, his back straight, eyes lowered. He hadn't spoken since the sack came off, hadn't asked where he was or who she was or why he was here. She moved slowly, deliberately, kneeling beside him. The cuffs around his wrists were crude iron, rusted but still firm. Her hands brushed his as she reached for the lock. The moment was thick, suspended. He could have pulled back. He didn't. The knife slipped beneath the rope. One careful twist, then another. The fibers loosened, frayed, fell to the dirt floor like discarded breath. His hands dropped, but he didn't move. Just looked at her directly, finally. Not with gratitude, not with suspicion. Just presence. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the far corner of the barn, where a pile of old blankets and straw lay forgotten. That's where he settled, cross-legged, his back to the wall. Esther didn't follow. That night she placed a bowl of stew and a slice of bread just outside the barn door. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply set it down and left the door slightly ajar, the way you might for someone you weren't sure would come home, but hoped they might. By morning the bowl was empty. Days passed like this. He didn't ask for anything. But every morning the woodpile outside the house grew. The chicken coop door was mended. A broken hinge on the porch swung straight again. He never came inside, never crossed her threshold. But piece by piece he fixed what had been neglected, not out of debt, not out of duty. As if in silence they had agreed to rebuild something neither of them could name. She kept cooking. He kept mending. The dog stopped growling. The horses stopped pacing when he passed. Even the wind seemed to watch, quieter now, unsure what to make of this truce. One evening, as the sun melted into the hills and the world turned blue and soft, she brought out 2 bowls instead of 1. She didn't say why. Just placed them both on the porch, then sat on the top step with her back to the barn. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of footsteps, bare, careful. He didn't sit next to her. Not yet. He chose the far end of the porch, a respectful distance. But they ate together under the sky with only the sound of spoons and crickets between them. It wasn't a beginning. It was something smaller, a pause in the grief, a flicker of warmth between 2 people who had every reason to remain cold. And somehow, that made it matter more. She found the blanket tucked in the back of a cedar chest, folded so carefully it still held the shape of the hands that last touched it. Woven with deep reds and dark blues, the wool was heavy with time, the pattern unmistakably Navajo. Esther didn't remember where it came from. Maybe it had been a gift. Maybe Arthur had traded for it once. But in that moment it didn't matter. She dusted it off gently, shook it in the evening light and walked it out to the barn. Bidzil was splitting logs behind the barn when she arrived. He didn't turn when she approached, just kept working, his movements steady and precise. Esther stepped inside, laid the blanket down on the cot of straw he'd built for himself. She smoothed it once with her palm, then turned and left without a word. Later that night, the lantern still lit in the barn's corner told her he'd seen it. But it was the next morning that confirmed what mattered. The blanket was draped over his shoulders, not as a shield, not out of need, but with a reverence that softened even his unyielding posture. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. Instead, something else passed between them. A pause in motion when their eyes met, a brief stillness that said more than conversation could. It was a gesture not of charity but of acknowledgement. She had seen him, not as labor, not as burden, but as a man with history, with roots, with memory sewn into patterns and wool. That night, after she left two bowls again on the porch, she lingered. The wind had quieted. The stars hung low, heavy. When he came, he didn't sit far away. He sat just close enough that their shoulders were almost aligned. They ate in silence. When the food was gone and the night had folded in around them, she brought out the oil lamp and placed it between them. Its glow stretched just far enough to illuminate his face and hers. Neither of them looked away. They sat like that for a long time, not talking, just breathing in sync, watching the flame flicker. And in that simple alignment, in the way her breath matched his, in the stillness they shared, was a kind of peace Esther hadn't known she'd been missing. She wasn't sure what came next. But for that moment, under that modest roof, with one blanket and one quiet presence beside her, the ache of loneliness softened at its edges. And that, for now, was enough. The lock had started to haunt her. Each time Esther heard the chains rattle, when Bidzil shifted in his sleep or moved too quickly through the barn, it was like a whisper at the edge of her conscience. Unfinished, unjust, inhuman. She didn't ask permission, didn't tell him where she was going. One morning she simply saddled her horse and rode back into town, coat pulled tight against the wind, eyes forward like someone chasing her own decision. Garrett Shaw, the man who had overseen the auction, leaned against the counter of the general store when she found him. He was chewing on a toothpick and grinning like always, but the grin faltered when she asked for the key. What key? He said, too casual. You know which one, she answered. He let the silence stretch. Other men in the store watched, the way wolves do when a deer steps into the clearing and doesn't run. Esther didn't flinch. Finally, with a sigh heavy with mock generosity, Garrett reached under the counter and pulled out a ring of iron. The key clanked when it hit the wood. Careful, widow, he muttered. You unchain a man like that, don't be surprised when he runs. Esther didn't answer. She took the key, turned, and walked out before anyone else had time to say a word. The snow had started to fall by the time she returned. Thick, slow flakes drifted through the air, catching in her lashes as she crossed the yard. Bidzil was splitting firewood again, bare arms taut, breath fogging in the cold. She didn't call his name, she still didn't know it. But he turned when she approached, saw the key in her hand, and went still. Without a word, he sat on the edge of the barn's stone step, lifted his foot, and waited. She knelt in front of him. The key was cold in her fingers, the iron stiff with rust. It took a few seconds, just long enough for her to feel the weight of it, what it meant, what it undid. The lock clicked, then the other. The chains slid down, landing in the snow with a muffled thud. Bidzil stared at them for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, not past her, not through her, but into her. My name, he said, his voice low and even, is Bidzil. It was the first time she heard him speak. The sound of it curled in the air like smoke from a fire just lit. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't have to. Because in that moment, with snow gathering around them and iron cooling in the frost, the man she had purchased no longer stood in borrowed silence. The snow came heavier that night, blanketing the land in a hush so complete it felt sacred. The barn roof groaned under its weight, and the old trees around the house stood frozen like sentinels. Esther lit the stove early, letting the smell of onions and broth drift through the cabin like a memory trying to come home. She didn't expect him to knock. Bidzil had never crossed the threshold of her house. There was a quiet respect in that distance, an understanding that some walls are more than wood and nails. But when the knock came, soft, deliberate, she didn't startle. She had already set 2 bowls on the table, though she hadn't told herself why. He stood in the doorway, the snow clinging to his shoulders, the firewood axe in one hand. "You left this," he said simply, holding it out to her. She took it, nodded, and stepped aside. Not an invitation, just an opening. He entered without hesitation, stomping snow from his boots, brushing ice from his sleeves. The warmth hit him immediately, but he didn't rush toward it. Instead, he waited as she ladled the soup, set bread on the table, poured water into 2 mismatched cups. They sat across from each other, the fire crackling between spoonfuls, the room wrapped in a silence that no longer felt hollow. There was no talk of the snow, no forced gratitude, no probing questions. Just the occasional glance, hers lingering slightly longer than his, and the small sound of warmth returning to skin and thought. At one point, a log in the fire popped, sending sparks upward. Both their eyes moved toward it, then back to each other. It felt like a conversation, though no words passed. She noticed, for the first time, the curve of his mouth when he relaxed, the way his fingers cradled the spoon like it might break if handled wrong. He noticed her sleeves rolled up, the small burned scar on her wrist, the softness in her face that the townsfolk never saw under her widow's quiet. There were no confessions, no grand declarations. But as the snow piled high against the windows and the oil lamp flickered low, something else grew in the space between them, a shared warmth, unspoken and real. Not yet love, not even companionship, perhaps, but the faint ember of recognition, the first fragile heat of something that could last through winter. In that small room beneath the hum of the storm, 2 people who had long since stopped hoping began. The fire had become their evening companion, no longer a necessity but a ritual. Each night, Esther would light it early, add an extra log, and let the warmth settle the air before Bidzil knocked. He never assumed. He always knocked. And she always opened the door without hesitation. That night she brought out a worn photograph. The corners were curled, the ink faded, but the outline of Arthur, young, tall, smiling awkwardly, was still clear. She set it on the table between them, beside the tea kettle and the shared silence. "He never liked having his picture taken," she said, almost to herself. Said it made him feel like someone was stealing time. Bidzil looked at the photo, then at her. His gaze was steady but gentle. "He died?" he asked, not to pry but to understand. She nodded. "Hunting trip, he never came back." There was no trembling in her voice, no drama. Just the quiet finality of something lived with for too long. She didn't cry. She had done all her crying in years that no one had seen. When she finally looked up, Bidzil was staring into the flames. His hands, usually still, fidgeted slightly with the edge of the tablecloth. "I walked with my uncle," he said. "The long walk. I was a boy. We lost 2 cousins before we reached Bosque Redondo. My mother never spoke again, Not after that winter. Esther said nothing. She didn't know the details of the long walk, not really. Only that it was a trail lined with sorrow and ash, that it had taken more than land. It had taken language, names, stories. It had taken home. They sat in that shared space of loss, the room growing quieter, not colder. For once, silence didn't mean absence. It meant presence. It meant, I won't interrupt your pain, I'll hold it with you. The kettle whistled, breaking the stillness. Esther rose, poured 2 cups, and returned. She handed him his without looking. He accepted it with both hands as if it were something sacred. You call him Arthur, Bidzil said after a moment. She nodded. In my tribe, when someone dies, we do not say their name for a long time. We wait, until it can be said with breath, not pain. Esther smiled faintly. Then maybe I'll wait with you, and you can teach me the way you remember. He nodded, a single motion, not agreement but understanding. In the weeks that followed, small things began to change. She showed him how to steep tea just so, when the water should speak but not scream. He taught her how to plant beans in 3 directions, how to read the clouds before a storm. She corrected his English with a gentle nudge. He taught her a Navajo word each morning, though she often stumbled over them, laughing at herself. They didn't talk about building a future, but each day some piece of their past softened. Each moment shared, a spoon passed, a window latched, a hand brushing another while clearing the table, became its own kind of medicine. They were not healing because of what they'd found in each other. They were healing because, for the first time, someone had stayed to witness what they hadn't. It was a Thursday when Garrett Shaw came back. The snow had begun to melt into muddy ruts along the main road, and the chickens were pecking at the thawing ground like nothing had changed. But Esther knew. She saw the 3 riders long before they reached the fence line, dusty, loud, smug in that way men are when they think the law is their mirror. Garrett dismounted first, brushing off his coat like he was shedding something important. The rifle on his back wasn't for show. Neither were the 2 men behind him, both younger, both staring at the house like it owed them something. Esther stepped out onto the porch with calm she didn't entirely feel. The air smelled of old frost and wet pine. She didn't speak, just leaned down, reached behind the wooden barrel and pulled out Arthur's rifle. It wasn't polished. It wasn't even loaded. But it was heavy, and it fit in her hands like a memory she could still control. Garrett laughed when he saw it. You think you can point that thing and keep what isn't yours. Esther didn't blink. He's not yours either. He's not anyone's, Garrett snapped. Which is the problem? You don't get to decide what happens to a stray. At that Bidzil appeared, not from the barn but from the trees, silent as breath on glass. He said nothing. Just walked until he stood between Esther and Garrett, his presence quiet, unmoving. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Move aside, Navajo, you don't speak for her. Still Bidzil didn't move. He didn't need to. His body was all statement, broad shoulders, bare arms crossed over his chest, calm like the earth before a storm. Esther took 1 step closer, rifle firm in her grip. I paid $1, she said evenly. But what I brought home wasn't something bought. It was someone who stayed. You think you can frighten me into giving that up? Garrett looked between them. between the stillness of the man and the fire in the woman, and for the first time he hesitated. Not because he feared the bullet, but because he knew whatever chain had once bound her had snapped. "You always were a stubborn witch," he muttered, turning to mount his horse. The others followed, grumbling, kicking up mud as they left the property behind. Bidzil turned to her slowly, face unreadable. Esther lowered the rifle, let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "I didn't load it," she confessed, almost smiling. He nodded. "Didn't need to." They stood there for a while, watching the last of the riders disappear into the trees. There was no cheering, no kiss, no triumphant music. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had drawn a line, and neither had flinched. Later that night, over tea, they didn't talk about Garrett. They didn't need to. The fire crackled and the dogs snored at their feet. A woman who had once whispered to her ghosts had spoken with her whole chest. And the man who had once lived in chains had stood unshaken, not as her shield. Spring crept in without announcement. Soft rain instead of snow, grass pushing through the thawed soil like a secret kept too long. The world outside Esther's house began to green, and inside something even quieter bloomed. There was no conversation about what they were to each other, no talk of love or belonging or permanence. Words like that felt too loud for the life they were building. Instead, they moved through days with an ease born not of passion but of understanding. In the mornings, Bidzil rose early to mend the fence, then left a bundle of wild herbs at the door. Esther baked bread and pressed the dough just a little thinner, knowing how he liked the crust. He built her a new shelf for her dried roots. She left his boots by the fire to warm before dusk. They didn't speak of gratitude. They didn't need to. She didn't ask where he went when he disappeared for hours at a time into the hills. And he never questioned the way she sometimes sat in the rocking chair with Arthur's picture, tracing the edges of the frame like a prayer. Their shared silences were not absence but presence. When they did speak, it was in simple things. "The soil's soft today. The sky's turning, tea." Each sentence was a thread, each answer a knot. One afternoon, a bird flew into the cabin and panicked, flapping wild against the windows. Esther opened the door and let it find its own way out. Bidzil watched quietly, then said, "Even a bird knows when to stay and when to leave." She nodded, meeting his gaze. This one stayed. There were no declarations, no rings, no need. The community stopped asking questions after a while. No one came to claim him, and no one dared question her right to make a home with someone she hadn't been told to choose. The town whispered, but softly now. Even gossip yields to time and steadiness. On Sunday mornings they sat on the porch with coffee. She read aloud from books she loved. He listened, nodding sometimes, offering a word or two when a phrase struck him. They didn't need to fill the space. The wind did that, and the fire and the garden. They grew side by side. Some nights when the moon was low and the dog long asleep, they sat close without touching, breathing in rhythm. If his hand found hers, it was gentle. If her head leaned against his shoulder, it was never planned. They had no names for what they were, but every day, in every motion, they chose each other. And sometimes, love doesn't need to be named to be real. It only needs to be lived, quietly, wholly, without end. It wasn't the dollar that changed everything. It was what came after. $1 didn't buy a man. It bought a moment, a pause in cruelty, a fracture in silence. A window opened wide enough for two lives to find each other in the storm. Esther never set out to save anyone. She was only trying to breathe again. Bidzil wasn't waiting to be rescued. He had survived too much to believe in rescue. But what neither of them saw coming was the way their loneliness, so different in shape but identical in ache, fit together like pieces from the same broken bowl. They didn't rescue each other from the world. The world stayed the same, unkind, unlistening. But in that small house with the oil lamp and the porch that creaked in the wind, they pulled each other from a quiet kind of drowning. No vows, no ceremony, just two people who chose each day not to walk away. And sometimes that's all redemption needs, just one step toward another soul, one soft rebellion against despair. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth $1.